Yeah, what has essentially surprised you the most out of everything?
I guess I've always been surprised with the degree to which people stay in their homes after their city or village has been just leveled.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 15th episode of the Universal Podcast, where psychology intersects with everything else. In this 15th episode, we'll be discussing psychology and conflict journalism with Fin de Pencier. Finn is a journalist, a photographer, and a filmmaker based in Toronto. Over the past few years, he has reported on the ground from Ukraine, Armenia, Lebanon, and Kazakhstan for outlets such as CTV News, C2C Journal, and Palladium Magazine. He's also released a number of films and documentaries. Finn, welcome.
Thank you, Samuel. I really appreciate it, man. It's been, I think, 2, 3 years since I was last in Armenia, which is how we know each other. I can't wait to get back. When are you going to be in Armenia next?
Probably in June. Probably in June I'll be in Armenia, and yeah, I mean I miss it all the time. I'm hoping maybe I could be there in February, but the chances are very low. But there's still a chance.
I'm much more of a spring guy in Yerevan myself, but why don't you ask me whatever you want, man? I'm excited for this.
Totally. Well, let's start with this. Do you want to just introduce yourself beyond what I've already said?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for 5 years now. In 2020, I dropped out of my business program. I was in my fourth year of undergrad when the pandemic hit, and I was paying full tuition to do Zoom University, and I just figured I need a change of scene here. And I'd always been really interested in journalism, kind of like writing some articles for student newspapers and whoever else would take my stuff throughout the course of my undergrad. And then I uh, I had a friend who was Armenian, and when the conflict broke out between Azerbaijan and Armenia, I took a really keen interest in it. And when the ceasefire was signed that November, I traveled to Armenia, and that was the beginning of my career. I just moved to Armenia and started freelancing, and I've been doing it ever since. I spent most of, I guess, 2021 there. And then 2022, like most conflict reporters, I had a pretty significant stint in Ukraine. And then when Hamas attacked Israel, and then when the war between Israel and Hezbollah started, I moved to Lebanon to start covering conflict there. And so I've been mostly based out of Lebanon since 2023.
Just to go through the timeline, that's basically November 2020 up until 2023, pretty much ceaselessly being out of the country, maybe with brief returns home from essentially conflict to conflict, right?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in some very dodgy places. I always come home for Christmas. Haven't missed a Christmas yet. I spend Christmases and summers in Canada. And it's not the most uncomfortable, tragic or scary environment always. Like, when I was covering war in Armenia, I was living in Yerevan, which, as you know, is a really comfortable place. And even in Beirut, there's a lot of excellent places to live as well. So it sounds like I had the most insane 3 years ever, but it's more like long breaks of monotonous work like everybody else, interrupted by very acute moments of danger and excitement.
Right.
I think a lot of people who've been in war will tell you similar things.
Right. So when I think of conflict journalism, I think of adrenaline junkies. And there's different ideas of adrenaline junkies. First, I think of adrenaline junkies for the obvious reason in that you're sort of chasing a conflict. You're chasing what many people are trying to escape from or adapt to in an emergency environment. And there's two different essentially theories of adrenaline junkies. One is by Marvin Zuckerman, who believes it's sort of this stable trait, like a personality trait. And personality psychology is a huge field. And the big five is one of the ones that's the most popular, where it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But Richard Solomon has this idea instead that it's almost like it's almost like that idea of benign masochism, that you have this threat which we don't react very positively to, but when we are out of the threat or able to escape from the threat, we have this huge rush of good feelings. It's why people skydive, it's why people watch horror films and things of that sort. So let me ask you, is that potentially some sort of facet of your attraction towards conflict journalism, or are there other things? What exactly brought you into conflict journalism as opposed to, let's say, writing about cooking or television?
Totally. So I am a huge believer in personality psychology. I've watched so much from Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson and all sorts of guys like that. I do think that I have a temperament that is conducive to the job that I do. I've always been a high risk taker. I've been someone who can tolerate a high degree of chaos. And I mean, it's it's something that's always felt like it fits for me. I mean, there's there's how I can manage myself in the environment. How I think I'm biologically inclined to doing things that are high risk and extracting a reward from that. Um, it's not so much chasing the absence of the threat. So I guess I'm more a believer in Zuckerman's theory of this.
That it's like a consistent personality trait that you have.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I've had people in my childhood reach out to me and say, this is entirely unsurprising that you ended up doing this. One friend said, like, I can't think of anybody else more inclined to do this kind of thing. And I'm really quite glad that I found an outlet for my high degree of um, or high tolerance to risk, and also, like, if we're talking um, about this from a big five perspective, I think I'm really high in extroversion and openness.
And probably very low in neuroticism, in your sensitivity to
Yeah,
negative stimuli.
yeah, I can definitely tolerate a high degree of um, criticism and danger, and all sorts of negative externalities that come with being a public persona. I mean, there's, actually being in the danger of a conflict, and then there's speaking about it online and having to constantly put myself out on a limb that way. That's also something that a lot of people find really hard to do. And to some degree, it's stressful for me as well, but I definitely tolerate it pretty well. Um, but I think, like, what's really made me most inclined towards conflict journalism as opposed to um, political journalism or travel journalism is that you get to witness the edge of human experience. These are, these the most intense um, experiences that human beings can have when you're speaking with someone, excuse me, who has lost their home, lost their country or their family, or is fighting for their country, someone who has homicidal rage at the enemy, or someone who's found the strength to forgive the enemy, someone who's involved
Right.
in, the peace building process. I'm always amazed by people who are reaching out to the other side of conflict, people in Israel and Palestine, people who are speaking with their counterparts at in international forums, that kind of thing. When they've been personally touched by the conflict, that always really impresses me. Um, and so those extreme experiences are very interesting to me, and I think it shows uh, the best and worst and most revealing sides of humanity.
First of all, what a compliment to be told that you had these qualities for a long period of time. I mean, that's definitely a rare quality to be able to keep your cool in times of conflict, and something that I think serves people in a number of ways. I mean, some people, when they're highly neurotic, for example, they might be upset that a train is delayed for 2 3 minutes, or that their zipper in their jacket isn't going up, or anything of that sort. But with a when you have very low neuroticism, your threshold for that kind of thing is, it just doesn't affect you the same way. That's, I would argue, a very, very big compliment, and something that again can transfer into a whole variety of sort of life's vicissitudes.
Hmm.
Speaking of the externalities of the human existence, you've been to you've covered conflicts in Asia, in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, and you've grown up in Canada. What is the most consistent thing you see in, I guess, in these conflicts, and what has sort of surprised you more than anything else as someone growing up in essentially a first world country? We can make fun of Canada all we want, but definitely a first world country. What was the thing that was the most surprising, and what was something that was, let's say, consistent in the people throughout these conflicts?
Every conflict has an aggressor and a defender. Every conflict has someone who has the upper hand, and it's never easy to be on either side. I mean, whoever's winning the war is accused of war crimes and colonialism and all sorts of crimes against humanity because they have the upper hand and they're seen as the oppressor. And then if you're losing the war, you're having to, deal with the loss of your homeland and all your, your family and your loved ones are killed. And I mean, it's always a really awful experience, no matter, who you're talking to on any side of the conflict. That's one consistency. The other consistency I'd say is the sorts of settings that I find myself in. So you're always going to be at a graveyard where miniature flags are, draped over the soldiers' headstones, and little mementos are left by their family. And
And often young soldiers, right?
absolutely, I distinctly remember walking through the cemetery in Yerevan, Yereblur, and seeing that a lot of those guys were the same age as I, and
Yeah.
that was a very difficult thing to come to terms with. I mean, I had voluntarily come to Armenia to cover this, and put myself in harm's way, and but a lot of these guys, they didn't have a choice but to fight for their country, and to be conscripted at an early age, and um, not even see the enemy.
Yeah, many between the ages of 18 and 22 is very sad that, many people call it, including myself, essentially losing a huge portion of a generation.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, like seeing the loss of life in the military, I don't think is really appreciated enough in this culture that is so human rights oriented, so legalistic. We talk so much about civilian casualties, but in Ukraine, for example, the vast number of soldiers killed are young men that were either conscripted or volunteers. And, if they've been killed in the last 2 years, chances are they were conscripted. And in some sense, you have to feel just as bad for those young men who are holding a gun and fighting for their country, whether they're on the right or wrong side of the conflict. They were dragged into this by fate, and so that's just something that's always bothered me. And it's a consistency. It really does bother me, the lack of compassion that I see for soldiers that lose their lives just in this culture that we have. But so you go to cemeteries you ask the same questions often, whether it's Ukraine or Lebanon or Armenia, to the family members that you see grieving there. Always hospitals, always, meeting a soldier that lost his leg. And uh, some people grapple with that really, uh, really commendably, and some people have great courage and a really positive outlook on life. They're gonna get back on their feet figuratively and literally, and then you see people falling into despair. These are the same sorts of stories that you find, at any hospital, in any war zone.
Right.
And then, going into a destroyed city or village, seeing how much of life can still go on. I've rarely been in a scenario where like an entire city or village is flattened. I remember the neighborhood of Baba Amr and Holmes and Martuni in Artsakh. Those are two areas where the place was just level. But usually you find little pockets of life, and it's really interesting to see to what extent normal life can go on. And you're always finding people living in the basements and um, sheltering with often their pets, and everybody on the same street. They used to have their own house with their own family. They're all now living in the same basement at the end of the block. Um, and it's interesting to photograph these places and pay attention to the contrast. Paying attention to what has been targeted, what has been perhaps indiscriminately shelled. You go to schools that have been destroyed or damaged, and one thing that I found over and over again is that militaries use schools to station their troops and to station their equipment, because schools make really, really advantageous military bases. They're large buildings with large basements and plumbing, and this is always something that uh, elicits the accusation of a war crime, but they do also just happen to be really advantageous buildings. So these sorts of things at the micro level, like when you're on the ground, um, just seeing conflict up close, it's very similar from conflict to conflict. It's when you zoom out at 30,000 feet that you see the larger differences, I think. But what else did you ask? The most surprising thing?
Yeah. What has essentially surprised you the most out of everything?
I guess I've always been surprised with the degree to which people stay in their homes after their city or village has been just leveled. And because people have nowhere else to go, or they perceive that they have nowhere else to go, they adapt to really, really horrible living conditions. I've seen time and time again people uh, just refuse to live in a refugee camp because they have too much dignity and they have too much pride, and they don't want to accept the uncertainty of living somewhere that isn't familiar to them, especially old people. That's a constant that I found. Old people are very reluctant to leave their homes, even if the danger is imminent. This is a huge problem in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is trying to evacuate all these frontline villages so that they can conduct operations in the nearby area, and pensioners are interfering with that work. They are sometimes giving information away to the Russians, and because they're so old, they think I'm closer to the end of life than the beginning. I'm going to die in my own home. So I've always been amazed by how people just kind of resign themselves to their fate.
Right. Yeah, and it's tough to even consider that as, we're both young. It's to have seemingly so much life ahead of us. It is a wild thing to consider that you sense that the conclusion is near, and you would rather live it in sort of a modicum of comfort of the familiarity of being where you have been for a long time. Yeah, that is that. I wonder too. How do you specifically shield yourself from the, I would argue, the broad spectrum of negative emotions one would probably endure, from rage to a sense of injustice to misery and pity? How do you shield yourself from that? Or do you just absorb it and then it's the next day? What is the sort of the process for you?
Well, I do absorb it. And when you're on the ground in one of these countries, the day-to-day action impedes you from thinking about it too much. You really can't let your emotions get in the way of doing your job. And I remember, I think it was Laurel Chore. No, it wasn't. It was a really renowned Vice correspondent. The name will come to me. She had an excellent observation. If you let your emotions get to you when you're out in the field, then you won't be able to ask the right question. If you're paying attention to uh, your emotions, if you're allowing yourself to grieve with the person who's just told you that, her son was killed in the battlefield, then you're not thinking about the next question, or you're not thinking about how to frame the next shot correctly. I think that over time, the trauma seeps in, and nobody will tell you that prolonged exposure to war zones hasn't affected them in some way. People have different breaking points. I wouldn't say I'm extremely low in neuroticism, as we said earlier. I'd say I'm, moderately low, and absorb, um, I absorb the experiences to the best of my ability. I think it's really important to know exactly what you're getting into, to not be naive at all about the nature of good and evil and what human beings are capable of doing to each other. I once read that people who are most likely to develop PTSD symptoms after conflict are those who they weren't being realistic about the sorts of things that they were going to see or that they were going to be forced to do. In the context of a soldier, uh, people really lose their minds, often not because of what they've seen, but because of what they've done to another person or been forced to do. And even in the journalism context, tempers flare, people have egos. This gets in the way of doing the job with a team. Um, and it's high stakes work. You always have some people that want to push it a little harder. Some people are more risk averse, and um, there's there's some tense interactions with colleagues sometimes. Um, but I would say that I try to maintain um, a really disciplined and focused mindset. It's very easy to reminisce about, some of, my scariest encounters in war zones, and, some of the more morbid things that I've had to report on. And I think it's also thinking about what comes next. I think this is an underappreciated aspect of mental anguish with people who work in war zones. It's knowing that you're going to have to go back out there, because trauma mentally is, it very much can be experienced when you think that, or when your nervous system hasn't adapted to a threat no longer being there. People, people went through a traumatic situation and their nervous system just hasn't adapted to the fact that they're no longer in that situation. But it's also knowing that, like, this is my job. I'm going to be in Lebanon, in Syria over the next few months. Israel is increasing its frequency of airstrikes in southern Lebanon. There's all sorts of conflicts that I know I'm going to witness in the future. And so thinking about how I'm going to manage that, I think, is something that comes up more than like ruminating. But you really have to stay focused and accept that these are the risks that were acceptable to you. You made this decision. No one forced me into doing this. I really love my job, and
It's important too that you're remembering the goal the entire time, because you're not, though you are experiencing the morbidity, if you don't record it and send it out to the world, then perhaps it won't be known. So that's perhaps a little bit of logotherapy in there, like the idea of, meaning being the thing that heals
Absolutely.
the trauma, which is the sort of the inability to cope with an event or occurrence.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah. And the hypervigilance makes sense. I mean, there's a reason why PTSD can't be diagnosed up until 30 days after, because hypervigilance when you're traumatized is a logical reaction. It makes sense to have a it's one of the symptoms is a heightened arousal. And that makes sense if you're in a if you've just experienced trauma in like a conflict area, because it could be another one and another one. But 30 days post trauma, if you still have that heightened vigilance, that's when they consider it
yeah,
post traumatic stress disorder symptoms.
absolutely. I would say that I've held up pretty good under pressure in the field, and I take my job really seriously. I'm never one to, go to the bar after we're doing a hard day of reporting. I used to do that kind of thing like at the beginning of my career, but when I work abroad now, I'm like working around the clock. Like I'm so committed to the craft. And it's interesting that you bring up logotherapy and meaning. I just read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and it's I think the most famous quote from the book. He who has a why can bear any how. And when you believe that
Right.
you're necessary to tell these stories, when you really think that you're there for a good reason, not a superficial reason. I'm not just there um, to tell the story the way that everybody else has said it. I'm not there to.
Make it flashy or cool or anything.
No, no. Like I really, I have a big um, I think I have a well developed sense of the responsibility that I shoulder when I do this kind of work, and I try to and that really drives me to accept the risks and to do it as forthrightly as I can.
Do you know the original name of that book?
Man's Search for Meaning? I do not.
In Spite of Everything, Choosing to Live,
Mm.
which I think is a fantastic, not just title, like encapsulating title, but also one that I think summarizes the book quite well. I mean, that book is, I think it's stood the test of time and is one of the most translated and circulated books for two reasons. One is it dives into horror and how to heal, and probably more specifically and relatedly, it's basically two kind of novelettes. One is the occurrences inside of the concentration camps, the sort of the social dynamics and the sort of the cognitive reflections. And the second part is specifically how to apply the therapy that he utilized, the idea of how do you use meaning as a healing mechanism while you're going through the pain. I think it's a fascinating concept.
Absolutely. And the way that he encourages people who are in such a dire situation to still choose to have a good attitude. I think that was one of the most important lessons that I took from that book. And the work really sucks sometimes. Like walking around with really heavy equipment on, and smelling dead bodies, like being close to explosions, waking up because there was an airstrike down the street, and you got to go take pictures of it, and arguing with editors about how much you should be paid and whether they'll cover expenses. Like sometimes it really does suck, but like I have such an enormous devotion to my craft, and I really do believe it's a very meaningful thing for me, and it sustains me because of how meaningful I find it.
Yeah, you know what I think of? The in 1964, your fellow Canadian and communications theorist Marshall McLuhan, in his book, what was it, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, has the famous axiom, the medium is the message. So my question is, what do you think the role is today and has been of the mainstream media, social media, and essentially citizen journalists that you see in everything from Telegram and Signal to Facebook, Instagram, and all of these sort of channels?
I think that this is so crucially important. People have a really bad media literacy nowadays. I don't think a lot of people really understand what journalism is at some, uh, at its most basic um, or at a more complicated level. Like, so journalism is really, it's a catch-all phrase. I think, the most foundational uh, way to be a journalist is to be a reporter, where you are collecting firsthand information. So you were on the ground, you spoke to this person, you saw what happened, you took the picture, you conducted the interview. And then there are opinion journalists that try to make sense of that. And there's a lot of people that I think look down their nose at people who share their opinions about things, but I think that's silly. It's absolutely a valid part of the media ecosystem. And then you have aggregators, who are people that are uh, posting or resharing whatever secondhand information. They haven't done the reporting; they're regurgitating other people's reporting.
Do you find that those people throw their opinion on the, to use your word, the aggregated regurgitations?
Totally. Well, there's journalists, and then there's people who are sharing the work of journalists. And for people on social media that are, kind of not citizen journalists, as you said earlier, but like kind of more activist type folks,
Mm,
um, they, I think this is the most problematic part of our media ecosystem. You have a lot of people who aren't um, trained in evaluating trustworthy information. A lot of people who are very gullible to misinformation. A lot of people who are viciously susceptible to confirmation bias. But nonetheless, the work is there to be shared, and everybody has the opportunity now to magnify journalists who are, doing that firsthand reporting. Everybody has a social media account, and there's all sorts of different theories about, you know, whether that's been good or bad for society at large or for, specific conversations. I think you have to take it at a on a case by case basis. But when it comes to the mainstream media, like big legacy institutions that have full time reporters and that are, devoting resources to collect that firsthand information. They're sending somebody to Ukraine, or they're scraping uh, the city council database for important documents. Those resources are indispensable to firsthand reporting. And without institutions, we wouldn't have anything but people just speculating and running their mouth about things that are completely unproven.
right.
Now, the media landscape has become totally democratized. So in the punditry space, for example, you have, the big network shows on CNN and Fox, and Newsmax is a more traditional competitor. You have, a right of center, maybe far right news outlet that tries to operate in the same way that Fox or CNN does, and then you have outlets like Breaking Points, which are trying to totally change up the industry. That's run by Crystal Ball and Saga and Jetty. I'm a huge fan of their show, and they're trying to do something completely different, but they're still creating an institution. They still have a business model whereby they're able to produce their own original work, their own original thought. And so whether it's Fox or Newsmax or Breaking Points, professional journalists that are doing this for a living, people who have good reporting instincts and and training uh, to find the right sources, to speak to the right people on the ground if you're doing field reporting. Like, those things are all really indispensable. And when it comes, and then, with people who are amplifying that reporting on social media, people who are just sharing stuff, it's like, you just hope that the public has a good bullshit detector. And
Right.
I don't, I don't have a good sense as to whether the democratization of the media landscape has been good for society or not, because there's been so many positive and negative externalities. But I do think that people are so adept at pattern recognition that I like to think that the dishonest, the irresponsible, and the unskilled people that have crowded into the space ultimately are going to succeed. And I think we're going to have, um, I think you'll always have the best voices, uh, the most skilled voices rise to the top in the end.
This works perfectly. I mean, I was going to ask you next what you think one of the most important events of the 21st century would be. And when I say important, I guess the most precise term I could replace that with would be, world changing. And I have my own answer, and it puts a little bit of tension against some of what you're saying, and it would be the Arab Spring conflict, which began in 2011, and sort of reshaped Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and there was a famous quote by a protester, an Egyptian protester, Fawaz Rashed, and he said, "We use Facebook to schedule the protests, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world." Now, in that circumstance, of course, there are certain regimes that limit the communications, or that control the state media. So the question, I guess, is, with that being sort of the reality, what is the extra onus on the people who genuinely want to capture the truth? And then what would you say is one of the most significant world changing events that has happened in the 25, 26 years of the 21st century?
Yeah, so I don't want to give off the impression that I'm not a believer of citizen journalism. I think it's so important that we have a good civic culture, especially in democracies like ours. And it's really inspiring to see a lot of establishment narratives just get blown apart by networks of ordinary people that are able to spot the bullshit. I just think I think the most important thing is that people understand the essential nature of true reporting. Of you still need journalistic institutions, and you need professional journalists to do that original work. And I think we have a culture that is so distrustful of institutions, whether it's, you know, in the media or the courts or, the academy. But media in particular is an area where people just do not trust the
Right.
people who used to be really, the arbiters of truth. The fifth estate, as they call it. And I think it's more important than ever that we don't abandon journalism as an institution, but that we reform it, and that we rebuild the institutions that still have some life in them, and that we build new responsible ones in their place that people can actually trust, and that so that we have some degree of shared understanding, and that so we have the same set of shared facts at our disposal. Um, but there's so many different things I could say about that. When it comes to the most important event of the last 25 years,
Yeah, single occurrence.
the financial crisis is a big one, 9/11, of course, but I'm going to pick COVID because it really disrupted the lives of billions of people in such a profound way. And when I contrast that with the reporting that I do in war zones, you have a really acute disruption in that country or region. people's lives are totally shattered. They lose their families, they lose their homes.
You were in Armenia at around the time of COVID
Yes.
in Armenia. You were there in the winter of 2020. It was also a time in which, sorry to interrupt you, I want to hear everything, uh, in which the Iranians were coming to Armenia specifically to get COVID vaccinations because it was not was available in Iran, but it would be 15,000 to $15,000 because of the rarity. So they would come to Armenia for 2 weeks, which is the about the mandated amount of time in which one could travel between nations, and then come back to Iran post vaccination.
Yeah, well, Armenia got hit with these twin crises. It was really incredible, actually, how unserious I found Armenia to take the pandemic. And I think because the country was going through a war, that just seems so much more acute. I think Armenia has a very libertarian
Right.
society, and people there, I find, are inherently skeptical of authority and rules. And
Well, when the Soviet Union collapses on you and the Ottoman Empire the Ottoman Turks, I should say, tried to genocide you multiple times, not just in the 1915, but in the 1890s as well. I think that's I think that's a little bit merited, and I'm sure many civilizations also have that same distrust should they have been in those kind of predicaments.
yeah, well, it's really it's a societal level thing, like, because Canada is a very sheep-like society. When the government tells us to do something, we do it. In Armenia, it's really like such a different culture, and I found that, rules are kind of created and then the people decide whether they're valid or not. I also found this with the smoking ban that was instituted. The government tried to ban smoking, and I presume that that's held up in a lot of the major population centers, but out in the villages in Armenia, like, it doesn't matter that it's illegal. Like, the people have been smoking
Do you see
inside.
that in other countries? Do you see that in other countries too after the pandemic? Because I think the pandemic definitely reset people's trust in institutions. Everything from what they were saying about the vaccine, which is repeatedly incorrect, like that it'll stop transmission. Everything from the 6 feet apart was pretty much arbitrary. Fauci said so pretty much verbatim. To how exactly the whether or not we should or shouldn't wear masks were both said with a sense of authority. So yeah, I think that's perhaps something that's increased the skepticism and also had a trickle down effect from government down to uh, media as well, where people just don't trust Fox or CNN or any of the big, former juggernauts of the media.
Totally. I think that the pandemic was one of the nails in the coffin of just like mainstream consensus and deference to authority. I was definitely disgusted at how they tried to shove the vaccine down our throats, and I did get vaccinated. I mean, I'm traveling across borders. Like, I really don't think I had a choice. But
Yeah, you had less of a choice. You had multiple governments demanding it.
exactly. But yeah, the pandemic was one of the most damaging things to public trust in institutions. I mean, with the vaccine, especially, just like the degree to which people were, betrayed by discovering that these ostensibly trustworthy institutions would lie to them for. And I think a lot of these institutional players had the public good in mind. I think, like, even if they knew that, okay, there are side effects, we are like causing all sorts of secondary health problems by locking you inside, but we think it's for the greater good because everybody needs to get this immune response, so we're going to lie to you about it anyway. Yeah, that was absolutely disastrous. And why I picked it, though, as the most important event is just because of how many lives it disrupted in total. Like, when I'm covering conflicts, so that affects so few people directly.
You mean in terms of the grand scale of like the world, of the 8 billion people in the world? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm also reporting for a Western audience. So when I, generally speaking, not entirely, but my work in Lebanon or Armenia, that's going to be read by people in the United States. or Canada, and those people are almost entirely removed from the negative externalities from that conflict. Now, you could say with the civil war in Syria that led to a refugee crisis that, caused all sorts of social disruption in Europe, and in Ukraine, you had an energy and a food shock that like caused inflation all around the world. But in general, people were not, I don't think, broadly conscious of how these conflicts directly affected them. But with COVID, it really just affected everybody that had to get vaccinated and stay inside, and or see their loved one die because of COVID. I think just because of the scale of it, that's the most significant.
Yeah, I think mine definitely is. Even though again the Arab Spring conflict was multinational, it was still relatively insular to something that went everywhere, to the islands, to archipelagos, to peninsula. Like literally every part of the earth was affected in some sort of way, shape, or form. Speaking of the humanity,
And I wouldn't be
oh, sorry.
sorry to interrupt. Like I wouldn't be who I am without the pandemic. If I hadn't been forced to stay inside and do Zoom University, I never would have dropped out of school and decided to be a conflict journalist. I always was interested in this kind of thing. Who knows how it would have turned out, but it really altered the course of most people's lives, honestly. I know, like, whether it was, losing your business or maybe even settling down in a relationship, the amount of COVID relationships that I know that are still ongoing, people who would have never met their future husband or wife if it weren't for the pandemic. Like, it was just a really life altering moment for all of us.
I think of the Cormac McCarthy quote: "You never know what worse luck your bad luck has saved you from."
Absolutely. That's a great quote.
Yeah,
I think about that often, especially in terms of, um, well, yeah, the pandemic and how um, I probably wouldn't have discovered this amazing career if it weren't
yeah.
for that. Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have met my girlfriend. I met her uh, uh, basically in the gym and wearing a mask that said "Peace for Armenians" and was wearing all Armenia stuff. And she was like, "You must be Armenian." I was like, "Maybe."
Ah,
Uh,
yes, I
yeah,
do, or whatever we say.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's funny.
Let me ask you, since we're talking about like the humanity and sort of ripple effects and sort of we'll say like incipient sparks that motivate a whole different destiny as opposed to what one was once expecting. For you specifically, who would you say is one of your top inspirations as a writer, as a journalist? You have people like Hunter S. Thompson, who, gonzo journalism would go directly into the conflict and almost become part of the conflict. You have people like George Orwell, who I think is like one of the most beautiful writers ever, who wrote about everything from the war to living as an impoverished person in London and Paris, which is a beautiful book, by the way, Down and Out in Paris and London. Walter Cronkite, obviously, with everything from everything and Vietnam. So, who would you say is like one of your biggest sort of motivations or inspirations?
Well, I'm gonna pick two. They're both extremely brave and effective journalists, but for very different reasons. So, the first one would be Trey Yingst. He just won an award for his work as an international correspondent. Trey is one of the most focused and prolific reporters that I know in the Middle East. He is putting out so much content. He's so on top of the ball, and he's so amazingly impartial. He lives in Israel, and he he reports on the Israel-Palestine conflict in a way that um, I think very few people are capable of. I have really, really strong feelings about that conflict, which is one of the reasons why I just find it very hard to be impartial. Many do, and Trey does that in such a way that he's developed amazing sources in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Israel. Like he really, um, he can talk to a wide variety of people because they know that he plays it straight, and he's just so incredibly disciplined with his message and prolific with the amount of work that he puts out. So that's one. The other one on the opposite end of the spectrum is Glenn Greenwald, who is one of the most fearless truth tellers that I know in the industry. I mean, he obviously became famous for breaking the Snowden story and has done all sorts of amazing investigative reporting. But now, I really follow him for his punditry at System Update. He's a really incisive commentator. He has such an amazing grasp of American politics and American culture, and he doesn't get obstructed by ideology. He really does not care whether a certain fact or narrative is inconvenient. I've seen him um, consistently take the left or the right side of an issue without any sort of um, consideration for how that might affect his standing with people in either camp. He's really, really amazing at just sticking to his guns and calling a spade a spade. And this is a good illustration of what I was talking about earlier, in that there's there's space in the media landscape for many different types of journalists. And what Trey does and what Glenn does are, I think, equally valid and important. And I admire them both.
That's awesome. I can't wait to look these people up. Oh, I obviously know Glenn Greenwald because of the Snowden story and the NSA and all of that sort of thing. I mean, that also leads to sort of my penultimate question, which is, what are your thoughts about just the nature of everything from algorithms to more specifically to AI, and how AI is sort of reshaping things as a journalist?
Yeah, it's terrifying, partly because it's coming for a lot of my job prospects. But
Everyone's. I mean, there's in if I'm not mistaken, in Kuwait, there's a weather woman who's not a woman. She's an AI, and one of the quotes that were listed about her was, "She's young, she's beautiful. You don't have to pay her much, and she'll never age." And I was like, "Oh, that is so ridiculously like offensive as a human."
it is, and I think that that speaks to how vulnerable people are that are doing easily replaceable jobs. I mean, anything that is without personality or too much. Uh, I mean, anything simple enough can be automated. So in the reporting world, like if you're just synthesizing information, if your job is like a social media manager for a news outlet, if your job is to, read over, um, government documents to find, what the important thing to report on is, all that is susceptible to automation. And so, it makes me think about the value that I put out there in the world. And I'm trying more and more to, as an individual, make myself indispensable, really build that trust with my audience, and continue to develop a body of work that um, can't be. I don't think that my work kind of stands alone for what it was. It speaks for itself, and my accomplishments speak for themselves. And I like to think, going down the line, little of what I've done can be automated. You're not going to have AI in the building in Syria interviewing the rebel. You can't have AI um, react under fire to, provide the really compelling news bite. Like maybe a weather girl, sure, like somebody who's doing something very monotonous, but I don't think that my specific job is going to get automated soon. But what AI is doing to our brains in terms of just like knowing exactly what we want and how that reinforces confirmation bias in our news feeds. That is something I worry about a ton.
That's a great point. I mean, that's especially bad in terms of global conflicts. I mean, I obviously feel a certain way about the Israel-Palestine conflict, about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, about uh, honestly every conflict. Definitely the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. I even shudder to call these conflicts, and I know that unless it gets finagled with, AI is just going to confirm how I feel about that particular thing, and might even enrage me even further.
I take a very um, I'm very diligent about getting out of my confirmation loopholes that the algorithm set for me. I have a very eclectic news media diet. I have very strong the Palestine thing in particular. I'm so disgusted by Israel's genocide, and I think what's even more disgusting for me is the impunity that has been shown to Israel and the way that we talk about this uh, differently than just about any other conflict, mostly because of how uh, how the Jewish diaspora is so traumatized by the Holocaust and everything else. Like so that particular. So I find it
Right.
very difficult to. I could never like be in Israel reporting like Trey does. I come in and out, and I'm objective when I do my reports there. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. But when it comes to
Of course. I mean, we can't not have opinions on these things, of course. It's just about to what degree do you make sure that you capture the sort of the objective realities and present it in ways that are,
Mhm.
we'll say, accessible to people.
Yeah, I think like even, and sorry, I've totally blown up your question. When I even look at the conflict in Lebanon with Hezbollah and the Lebanese army and then Israel and Palestinian militias, I find it a lot easier to be objective in that sense because there's not a genocide happening in Lebanon that is being supported by my
Right.
government.
And to Israel's credit, you do have many Jewish people in Israel condemning Bibi Netanyahu and their entire regime. I mean, that's there's been many
Oh,
protests.
absolutely. Yes, there is a very rich contingent of anti-Zionist Jews, and maybe they wouldn't even call them. A lot of people believe in the state of Israel, but just are disgusted by what's happening. Um,
Right.
and I really do admire Trey because of how he can keep it under wraps in such an awful circumstance. Um, and yeah, like bringing it back to AI, I am most worried about the reinforcement of confirmation bias, even before the algorithms were knowing exactly how to, target our neurons. This was already a huge problem. Something like 92% of New York Times subscribers are Democrats, and probably an equal amount of Fox News watchers are Republicans. There is a
Yeah, probably more than 92%. Yeah.
95, whatever it is, there is a trend
Yeah.
towards news media becoming political entertainment. And anytime that you can break through to somebody's echo chamber, that's really, really important. And I do try to do that as much as possible. That is probably one of the most important tasks that's incumbent on us as journalists is um, to try to cultivate uh, that shared understanding of common fact because that is it is absolutely slipping away from us.
Without catering to any sort of like cognitive bias. Yeah, that's true, and that leads me to my last question, which is, can you tell us what you have on the horizon and what we should be looking forward to as we follow your upcoming endeavors?
Yeah, so I'm going back to Lebanon and Syria in a couple weeks. I think I'll be spending most of the spring of 2026 in Lebanon and Syria. I'll also be going to Poland to visit my friend Colin Mayfield, who was injured in Myanmar a couple of weeks ago. He stepped on a landmine, and he's about the luckiest guy to ever step on a landmine. He only lost part of his foot, and he might not need an amputation. He's going to find out soon. But anyway, we've been making a documentary about the conflict there for quite a while, and he has now um, unexpectedly become a very central part of the film. So I'll be going there to interview him and film some of his rehabilitation.
Do you have a name for this film or?
Our working title is Hunting Tyrants, and um, I'll let people see it and not spill the beans as to what that means. Um, that's gonna be that's the project that I'm most excited for. Colin has done something that most people in my industry never could. He took an enormous amount of risk to go to an extremely remote part of the world to get this footage, and so I'm really excited to do that. Personally,
Where can we
you know,
watch that, by the way?
you can watch the first part of it on Kilo TV on their YouTube channel. That's Qilo TV. That's what I'm most excited for. I have a big piece coming out in the Toronto Star in a couple weeks about Syrian refugees, all sorts of random projects. You have to be um, really like okay with uncertainty. I mean, the news business is inherently unpredictable, and
Yeah.
you can't really be proactive.
You don't know what the world's going to say. You're just the one who's the
Yeah,
sort of the
exactly.
mediator.
So I always say you have to
Yeah.
be reactive as opposed to proactive in journalism, um, which is almost the opposite of the mindset that people want for almost any other situation. You want to be able to plan and anticipate, but in journalism, you have to tolerate that level of uncertainty.
Right.
So I have a couple things. I know I'm going back to Lebanon and Syria. I've got that one project, but who knows really what the new year holds.
Right. How can people follow you?
I post most of my work on Instagram at Finn Looked Into It, Finn with one N, and on X, same handle. Um, but definitely on Instagram. That's where all my best stuff is.
Right. And I've been following you for about 5 years. And I'll say that you do a great job at sort of condensing information into a way that's accessible, that has an emotional resonance in it, but doesn't necessarily sway to the point of being opinion. Emotion can be so high that it becomes that you lose the fact, the object, and it becomes some sort of distortion. I appreciate that from you because I feel like I'm reading something from someone who's taking a conflict seriously and objectively, which I don't think I can do. I don't think I have that ability.
Well, on my Instagram and with a lot of the short form compact stuff that I'm doing, I'm trying to bridge analysis, 30,000 foot analysis of what's happening in a conflict with a very personal experience that I've had on the ground and connect those two. That's, I think, what makes my work credible, and I think that's what most people follow me for. I've actually witnessed these things, and I don't purport to be an expert in most of what I'm talking about. Journalists are rarely experts in their fields, but we are witnesses to history in real time. Journalists write the first draft of history, as it's sometimes said, and we're there to evaluate trustworthy information and um, uh, to tell the stories of people that um, can't tell those stories themselves.
Finn, it has been my experience that very few people whom I would call experts ever call themselves experts. So I think you are definitely in that category of someone who's in that realm of expertise, and I really thank you for coming on to the 15th episode of Interversal, and I'm just very hopeful for what you're going to be showing us next around the world. And again, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Sam. Anytime. I look forward to promoting it, and I hope to see you in Armenia sometime soon.